for you, and we will expect your thoughts for questions and comments. My name is József. I am Managing Director of Transparency International Hungary, also lecturer at Corvinus University of Budapest. So we will continue the previous panel, basically, speaking about the future of Europe with the constitutional perspective this time, and a number of presentations and papers which were submitted to this workshop was dealing or deals with the democratic and rule of law backsliding and how to counter it. Not all of them, but some of them. So I am sure that there will be a vivid discussion about it after the presentation. So let me give the floor to the first presenter, who is András JAKAB, professor of University of Salzburg, and he will share with you a very interesting thought experiment about the full parliamentarization of the EU without changing the treaties. So András, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I prepared a short slide series about it. So full parliament, thank you again. The title is Full Parliamentarization of the European Union without changing the treaties. Why we should aim for it and how easily it can be achieved. I'm going to give you the solution for all the problems in the next 5 minutes. The European Union, if I can handle the PPT. Yeah. So first, just for clarification, what kind of concept of democracy I'm using in my presentation. It's a very simplistic democracy concept. Basically, I mean by democracy the ability to get rid of the government in a peaceful way. So if we don't like what the government is doing, we can kick them out of power. To put it simply, what are the virtues or what are the advantages of this form of government? Why is it advantageous for a country if they compete with other countries? I would like to emphasize 2 points. One, it generates loyalty. Why? Because if you have a say who is sitting in your government, then you feel more that it is actually your country and your government, and in crisis situations it's more likely that you're gonna stick with it, especially in conflict situations. And second, it has a self-correction potential, so if the government is not doing properly the job, you can kick them out. So in non-democratic countries, you just have to hope that, I don't know, the dictator or the king is going to die, and then you have to wait 30 or 40 years, or if it's Fidel Castro, then maybe 60 years. But if it's a democratic country, you just have to wait 4 years, and then you can kick them out, which makes the country much more likely to prosper economically, because if the government is not doing a good job, if the economy is down, then you can try another government. So these are the advantages of democracy. Just a short remark about output legitimacy. Sometimes, especially in the context of the European Union, it's mentioned that the European Union is, yes, it's not really democratic, but we should just appreciate the output of the European Union, to what kind of results it led. And it is true that output can legitimize to a certain degree, but it cannot really substitute democratic claims, or it cannot counterbalance democratic claims, especially not because output legitimacy is only a solution, or it's only an answer to the legitimacy question if you have success. So especially in crisis situations like economic crisis times, then it just doesn't work. So it does exist this type of explanation, but I think if we talk about the European Union, legitimacy issues of the European Union, then output legitimacy is not the real answer. The real answer is democratic legitimacy. So we need democracy, but what kind of democracy we need for the European Union? What kind of democracy do we have, and what kind of democracy should we have in the European Union? So what are the criteria for well-functioning democracy? I'm not going to talk too much about it, just a short remark. Obviously, can have different types, direct democracy or representative democracy, and we all know that modern democracies are representative democracies. Classical arguments are well known. We just don't have the time, we don't have slaves to do the job for us, like in ancient Athens and so on. We also need political freedoms for a well-functioning democracy. That's why illiberal democracies are like it's a paradox in terms. So if you don't really have political freedoms, then it's not going to work, because democracy doesn't mean that you can go every 4 years to the polls. What democracy really means is the ability to kick out your government from power, and without political freedom, it's just not gonna work. Sometimes in the third point, sometimes in the context of the European Union, it's mentioned that you need statehood for a democracy, and that the European Union can never be a democracy because it's not a state. Especially in the German literature, it's a favorite argument. Actually, even the German Federal Constitutional Court mentions this argument. I'll be totally honest with you, I never really understood what's going on. I think that's just a very, so in German you say salonfähig, so it's a very nice way to put your Eurosceptic arguments when you talk about statehood as a precondition of democracy. Fourth one, also often mentioned that you need some homogeneous demos, and I have some doubts. It's true that it can be useful, but I don't think that's a necessary precondition. Again, we have quite a few functioning democracies in the world where you don't have homogeneous demos, like Switzerland or Canada are usual examples that are mentioned. What you rather need is not so much cultural homogeneity, but a certain minimal level of financial homogeneity. So not just 1% mega rich and 90% starving, then it's not going to work. But you need strong middle classes. But again, I think that's not really the key issue when we talk about democratic deficit in the European Union. That's not the key issue. What we talk about, that's not the real problem. Sometimes also mentioned that what you need for democracies is democratic mentality. Again, the famous example is the Weimar Republic, which is I can quote Georg Lukács, famous Hungarian philosopher, actually Marxist philosopher. Nobody was perfect anyway. So that he said, and at this point he was actually right, that the Weimar Republic was basically a republic without republicans, democracy without the democrats, and it obviously didn't work. But I think that's not the key problem in the European Union either. Suspense still, I'm going to tell you what the real problem is on the next slide, but I still have one more point here. That's what we need for a well-functioning democracy. That's interested public opinion and media coverage. And for a long time it was always mentioned that, well, the real problem in the European Union is that we just don't have the infrastructure in media, and people are just not interested in what's going on. That's why it doesn't work. And that was more or less true, and that was a real problem. I think that was just a secondary consequence of the real problem that's coming on the next slide in 10 seconds. But I think this point actually got much better with the crisis. If we can thank for anything to the last years of crisis, that's exactly having more interest in average citizens for the problems of the European Union. We know, and the average citizens know much more about the European Union now than 10 years ago, and the reason is exactly the crisis, because it's crumbling and something is not going right, but mainly on the economic level. So what's the solution? It's coming. 3, 2, 1. Yeah. So I think that the real problem, what we call democratic deficit, is the missing direct link between election and responsibility. That's the key problem. So basically the popular will is not effective. Why is it not effective? Because the European Commission, which would be the government of the European Union, we cannot kick them out so simply. Or at least it is not so straightforward. The situation is getting better, but it is very far from being straightforward. As you know, the procedure is pretty complicated. It's basically the European Council has to propose the President of the Commission to the European Parliament, and the European Parliament then has to accept it or reject it. And then in the second round, the President of the European Commission prepares a list of the commissioners, which is approved again by the European Council and then by the European Parliament. So why is the problem? Why is it not democratic in the sense that I use it in the very beginning, that we can kick out the government from its place? Why is it not democratic? Because when we go to the polls at the European Parliament elections, we only vote for the European Parliament. But as a matter of fact, the key at least on paper, the key decision-maker body is not the European Parliament, but it's the European Council. The European Parliament has just a veto power in the procedure, at least if you only have a look at the paper. So what could we do? What would be the solution? Before I come to the solution, again, a little bit of suspense for 1 more minute, some counter-arguments. Some people say that, well, it's not really a problem because the European Union is democratic in its form, because we have some kind of democratic chains leading back always to the people. Why? Because in the European Council, who is sitting in the European Council, who are sitting in the European Council, prime ministers and our presidential systems, the president of the Republic, like for example from France. And they are somehow directly or indirectly elected by their own people. So somehow at the end of the day, if we have enough steps, then we're going to get back to the people. I don't think that's actually a good answer to the question, because here again, democracy doesn't mean this conceptual game that sooner or later you get back to the people. I know that that looks very good in a constitutional textbook, but democracy means, in the sense I'm using it, that you can kick out your government from power. The problem is in the European Parliament elections you can't do that, and you will never be able to kick out the European Council from its power. Why? Because you can only kick out one of them, your own prime minister, if you're lucky. But all the others will stay for a long time unless the other citizens in the other countries decide that. So that's not a good counter-argument. Or sometimes it is said that, well, the EU as such has democratic origins. Why? Because the treaties were ratified in democratic procedure, so everything is fine. Again, I think that's just a conceptual game instead of 1 minute, and I'm not talking about counter-arguments anymore. They are weak anyway. So what should be done? What should be done? Should we modify the treaties? I think it's very unlikely that it can be done, because modifying the treaties in a direction which would give more powers to the European Parliament and less to the European Council would mean that member state politicians would give up their powers, and no normal politician likes giving up powers, so it's not going to happen. Creative judicial interpretation, sometimes it did happen in the history of the European integration. Direct effect of directives, for example, was a counter-legum interpretation of the treaties, but I don't think that's the real solution here. It's too politicized. So what can be done? Basically, the European Parliament has a blackmailing potential, and they already did use that. It was the first time they did use it, that was with the Barroso Commission. Even though on paper the European Council could propose anybody they wanted to propose. I think first they proposed a Dutch politician, nobody remembers his name, including me, because he didn't get the position, because the European Parliament just rejected the guy, and then they said they want somebody else, they want somebody who is from their political color. This is how Barroso got into place, and even one step further when the very last time the European Parliament elections, when the European parties, political parties had this Spitzenkandidat, and so we are moving into that direction. And this is very similar to what we had in British constitutional. In British constitutional law, the Queen can appoint anybody to become Prime Minister. The Prime Minister on paper in British constitutional law is just an advisor to the Queen. But in practice, the Queen will only propose somebody who has the majority support in the House of Commons. Why? Because otherwise the whole thing is just not going to work, and the House of Commons is not going to vote for tax laws and so on. And it's pretty similar in the European Union. What we can see is a similar movement. So basically, on paper, in theory, the European Council could vote for anybody or could propose anybody, but in practice, the European Parliament has a veto power. We are moving into that direction. It's not formalized, and also 1.5 years ago, the Council Legal Service even objected against any formalization which would go into this direction, but it doesn't really matter, because in an informal way, we are still moving into that direction. And the very last slides, some recent developments. You probably heard about this proposal that after Brexit, the British MEPCs should be somehow either distributed, or even better, we should have a special European list. So basically, everybody at the European Parliament election should have 2 votes, one for your own country representatives, and there should be one common European list with 73 seats where you could, which would not be bound to the individual countries. The idea is not new, actually. It came up first, as far as I know, 6 years ago by a British MEP. It's a bit ironic. He suggested it, Andrew Duff, that we should have like 10% of the European Parliament seats. We should have them elected in this way, but it wasn't realized or wasn't implemented. There are 2 statements. Actually, also they were referred to in the call for papers or in the short description of this conference, which I would like to comment. One is that it is up to the European Parliament itself to propose the 2019 electoral rules. In this way, it is incomplete, even though it is true. But as a matter of fact, you need the Council to act unanimously, according to Article 223 of the Treaty of the European Union. So just because the European Parliament thinks that it would be a good idea, it's not going to work. You need, once again, a unanimous decision by the Council. They should actually modify that. It's an old act from 1976. And second, it was also in one of the articles that was referred to in this conference description, that Brexit requires that the 73 UK MEPs seats are redistributed. That's actually false, as far as I understand the situation, because the MEP numbers are explicitly regulated in the treaty itself. So if you want to introduce anything like this, you need a treaty modification, a formal treaty modification, with the usual problems. So it's going to be a hard tool. Thanks.
Thank you very much, András, for this very interesting presentation. It was exactly 15 minutes, so we will adjust the rules to the reality this time. So the others will have also the opportunity to speak 15 minutes, but obviously if you can squeeze your presentation into 10 minutes, then it's, or between 10 and 15 minutes, then it's fine as well. So the next presenter will be Dimitry Kochenov. Dimitry is a professor in Groningen, in Holland, and the title of his presentation is The Principles Behind the Distribution of EU Rights and the Periphery.
I will not focus on the periphery so much. I will just put the periphery into the context of how the rights are distributed. But rights to me are the rights with a human face. So I will be speaking about what the citizens directly derive from the EU legal system, rather than general considerations of prosperity, peace, etc. And in doing this, I will connect directly to what András has been describing, because I think we could add one more, flaw onto the list of what is going wrong with the EU democratic system, and that's something that neither the European Parliament nor the citizens of the European Union can change. So the European Union was built with all the great ideals in mind. We have prosperity, we have peace, we have common destiny for Europe, this proclamation of the Fédération Européenne to come. But in fact, among the tools that were available to the member states to reach those ends, the ends which we all agree upon, only one ended up surviving the leverage of the European Defence Community Treaty and Political Community Treaty and all the treaty modifications. So the thing that survived is the internal market. So the internal market, which was designed to be the tool to get to those great ideals, actually ended up to be not only the tool, but also the ideal in itself. So now we have these treaties with unchangeable objectives. One of the main objectives of the EU, and actually probably the only one, is actually to build a perfect internal market. It's presented as apolitical to us. So whatever is political in the EU is not about changing the treaty via the institutions. The institutions cannot do it. And as long as you cannot change the treaty via the institutions, you are tied to this idea of the internal market as the panacea for all the negative outcomes of our integration. So in fact, what we're speaking about when we're speaking about politicizing the EU, we're speaking about the democracy of means, how to get to the internal market, not the democracy of ends, what the European Union citizens actually want for themselves as a suitable ideal for the integration project. So here there is the main problem, I think, with democracy, and probably the problem to discuss in the context of your proposal. Because without changing the treaties, you cannot simply change the set of objectives of integration. When the market actually delivered what it was supposed to deliver, we were all fine. And that's when all the output legitimacy literature arose, and this is when, of course, there was democratic deficit debate, but it was a luxury problem rather than probably the actual problem. It was a luxury problem because there was conversation with the Bundesverfassungsgericht, which we know from social science, etc., didn't have any point. All this Brexit debate is absolutely mute. So if someone doesn't have a point, you engage with that with that institution, and prosperity is actually there, and peace is actually there. But then probably it's not a relevant debate. But now that we had Greece, and now that we have not only prosperity that is not around, but also probably the values which were behind the three initial ideals are not around anymore either, like in Hungary and Poland, then we are facing a much harsher reality, and a totally changed reality actually, compared with, say, 20, 30 years ago. And this reality is a reality when the main means of getting to the great ends has failed, and you cannot change it democratically, because this is something that is preset in the treaties, and you have to live with it. And so now let's see how the internal market, as it's regulated in European law, and as it's understood by the Court of Justice, actually helps us solve the fundamental problems that we are facing, especially in the periphery. And here we face plenty of problems. The first premise of this internal market regulation was that it's not actually political. It was not actually political integration, and thus it didn't touch the core of the political fabric of the member states and the core of the constitutional fabric of the member states, beyond, of course, telling them, by the way, there is a supreme law out there which is directly effective in your legal system. Then it's up to your Bundesverfassungsgerichts and other places, other seats of power, how you deal with that. So from some countries we've never heard much. So we hope something positive is happening there, but probably not. In fact, there are no really compelling overviews of how EU law actually works on the ground. And if you speak with the judges of the lowest courts, but at least wearing a European Union law professor's hat, you are usually simply horrified, because they have no clue. And if they don't have any clue, then most likely the plenty of parties in front of those courts don't actually benefit from any kind of EU law protection either. So we don't have a special system of EU courts that would go down to the actual consumers of justice, and that might be another problem. But the bigger problem is how the EU configures its own powers in the face of what the member states are supposed to do. So basically the division of powers between the federal level and the national level, or just to use this language, not charging it too much. And that division is always going along the lines of the presumed benefits that the internal market is there to produce. So in order to get any kind of rights as an individual in the context of European supranational law, you need to be a good citizen in the eyes of this European supranational law. And the good citizen is the one who ventures outside of the home member state usually, either by providing services or by getting hired by someone foreign, and then stays there at least for a while, and somehow is interested in what's going on out there, outside of home. And that activates, as the Court of Justice tells us, equality before the law for that particular citizen. So the law is not the law about the protection of the home. The law is not the law about the protection of the family. The law is not about what we all cherish at the national level, which is basic equality before the law. because everybody who qualifies to benefit from the supranational legal system is obviously carved out from the national legal system. So in this sense, the internal market is the pretext to mute the provision in the French constitution which claims that all the Frenchmen are equal. Of course they are not, as long as the EU is around. So if we're happy with that, and we were happy with that when the internal market delivered what it was supposed to deliver, it was no problem. But now when we probably are not anymore happy with that, we observe the values landscape in Hungary, in Poland, in Brussels, but also in Paris, and we start thinking, but wait a second, actually the European Union could be eroding the core of our legal systems through basically making every constitution in every single member state to break the promises given to all the citizens of that particular member state. In this sense, when you somehow make a provision in a constitution that claims that every Frenchman is equal to every other Frenchman, and then the EU law tells you that some Frenchmen are more equal, and you thereby distinguish between two different categories of national citizens, you can have very weighty, or you should have very weighty justifications for that. And the justifications that are given usually, this person contributes to the internal market, and this person doesn't. So, and very often the contribution to the internal market, of course, it's not an economically understood state of affairs. This is something that is juridically defined. So you're presumed to be contributing to the internal market if you change states, for instance. And no matter whether you, well, now it probably matters a little bit, but in theory, no matter whether you work or not, actually. And nobody makes any economic studies whether you actually contributed to the development of the internal market having moved. So buy a bus ticket from Northern Ireland to Ireland, to the Republic, and you are fine. Then you might be covered by EU law. That might save your family, that might prohibit the national authorities from deporting your husband, that might give you some economic opportunities, especially if you have handicapped children. You might be saved from being confined to 24/7 sitting at home, etc. I'm just giving examples from the case law of the European Court of Justice, where the Court of Justice says this woman is married to a man who is being deported by the UK authorities. Under EU law, he would have automatic rights to stay, but since she has never worked, unfortunately she has a handicapped child, she hasn't contributed to the internal market, so the man will be deported, and she should think about how to become a better European citizen. I'm paraphrasing, but the logic is this. So that if you deploy this kind of logic of a very ideologized and very demanding idea of good citizenship at the supranational level that potentially undermines what the national constitutions actually propose and presumably guarantee, then you are basically building a constitutional system which is based on ethically void promises, which the citizens are required to give to someone in Brussels and required to deliver on by buying tickets to cross non-existent borders. This is not a mature constitutional system, and this can only be changed, of course, if you start thinking about the division of competences between the member states and the union differently. So let's look at how these contributions to the internal market entre parenthèses actually work. There is a one-way movement in the European Union. It's not that all the Dutchmen are here in Brussels opening pubs. So when we look at the flows of labor and the flows of citizens, the flows are one way. It's the UK, it's Germany, it's a couple of other member states. And since the EU law doesn't protect anyone's rights at home, so you know if you don't move to Germany from here, you will most likely be worse off compared with your Hungarian neighbor who has just returned from Germany, because that's how EU law works. And no matter what the Hungarian constitution promises, EU law is supreme, right? So, in fact, the EU law works in such a way that the good citizen is the one who leaves the periphery and goes to the center, and who is proclaimed to be contributing, and then only those people actually benefit from equality before the law. So this is a citizenship of personal circumstances. Before looking at your status, the court looks at your CV. And this is exactly like the pre-French constitutional ideal, or pre-French revolutionary ideal. When your status and your parcours in life actually determines what kind of law applies to you. This is too pre-modern to be appealing to anyone. You cannot possibly build a democracy, you cannot even build a good autocracy on this. Because of course it's very fluid, what kind of border you can cross, or you should be crossing, and what kind of ticket you should be holding, and what kind of intentions, sometimes intentions also matter, what kind of intentions you should have in mind. So the EU itself is also a very problematic animal, and that's probably my main point. So it hasn't delivered the enforcement of values at the national level, what Laurent will be speaking about, and it has actually contributed in a different way by preempting the citizens of Europe from deciding what Europe is about. Because the goal is there, it's clear, it's unchangeable. All the institutions are not about changing the goal, all the institutions are about reaching it. And that goal is the only thing that the court always keeps in mind in distributing the powers between the member states and the Union. The Union actually emerges as a potentially strong totalitarian, authoritarian actor that mingles with our lives by labeling us as good or bad, based on its own vision of our economic activity, or its own vision of what should be good and what should be considered as bad in the way how we live our lives. It's very similar to what the Soviet Union was doing. Unfortunately, I will invoke the country of my birth. And the best testimony to how you produce a good citizen is probably what that process, that was the court case that was ongoing in Leningrad was at the end of the 60s, when Brodsky was told that writing poems is not a contribution to the development of Soviet economy, and as a lazy layabout, he will have to spend several years in Siberia to learn how to labor in order to be a good citizen and to benefit from the Soviet institutional system. So this is a very sad comparison, but I think it's true.
Thank you very much, Dimitry, for your presentation. I think some of your statements might provoke some debate, but let's postpone the debate and the comments for the Q&A session. And now the next speaker will be Laurent Pech, who is head of Law and Politics Departments at Middlesex University in London. And the title of the presentation is Illiberalism Within, Rule of Law Backsliding in the EU.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to essentially give you a summary of some of the key points made in this article, which was just published actually yesterday. But the draft version of this article has been online for quite some time. So just some of the key points, and essentially what this article is about is what we call with Kim Shepele rule of law backsliding, and we analyze two countries, our two main case studies, I'm afraid. Hungary is one of the two, with Poland. Before I tell you what the EU has been doing and whether he has been successful in trying to prevent or roll back rule of law backsliding, perhaps just a few words on the notion of rule of law backsliding. You can obviously read the article for more details. But we thought that it would be useful before analyzing the situation in Hungary and Poland to try to define what we're talking about, because essentially some people, we call it rule of law backsliding, but it can be, there are several notions essentially trying to make sense of the situation in Hungary and Poland. What we call rule of law backsliding, essentially it's a systemic process of dismantling checks and balances by the ruling party with the view of essentially guaranteeing the long-term reign of the party regardless of whether elections take place subsequently after you have won the first elections. So it's a process. Rule of law backsliding is a process, and this process, the aim of this process is to destroy essentially the rule of law slowly but surely on the basis of what we have described through 8 steps in this article. So not only does the article give you an attempt to define what is rule of law backsliding, but by studying Hungary, Poland, and countries like also non-EU countries, because this is happening all over the place. I'm afraid now we have 2 European examples, but it doesn't mean it's only happening in Europe, on the contrary. So it's a process, and what's also interesting is that autocrats seem to be learning from one another. And what's happening in Poland, actually, I quickly understood what was happening in Poland because I had spent some time trying to make sense of Orban's moves in Hungary and how he dismantled checks and balances very progressively, very smartly, I must say, as a lawyer. The lawyers working for Orban, they're quite good, which makes fighting them back through legal means quite difficult. The lawyers working for the British government seem to be less effective, so perhaps there's hope on this front. Anyway, so the process. So it's a process, and we can perhaps discuss during the Q&A whether you agree or not with our definition. You can also, Professor Müller from Princeton speaks of constitutional capture, which is also quite closely connected. So essentially, how does it work in practical terms? You win elections fairly, squarely, and then slowly but surely, before the next elections are supposed to be organized, you're going to make sure that all the rules of the game are rewritten in your favor. The first step, normally, in whenever you want to undermine a constitutional system based on the rule of law, the first step is actually always almost the same, regardless of the country. You take control, you capture the constitutional tribunal or whatever Supreme Courts you have, plus you take control of the public sector media very quickly. So then you can shape the narrative, and through having captured the constitutional court or the Supreme Courts, then you can violate the constitution at will. There's no one left. And once you can adopt legislation in violation of the constitution, then you can take control of all the other checks and balances, and if anyone is resisting, then you just dismantle whatever body is not obeying the new king. So this is part 1, essentially, of the article, trying to make sense of rule of law backsliding, because being a French lawyer myself, it took me quite some time to understand what was happening in Hungary. It's only through talking to many friends, not only from Hungary, but from outside of Hungary. It took me perhaps, I didn't quite understand the situation in Hungary. I mean, I'm not claiming my understanding is the correct one, but let's just say that it wasn't until 2014 that I started worrying about the situation in Hungary. Until 2014, I thought just, the ruling party trying to win the elections and maximizing power, using sometimes crossing the line, but I didn't think it was quite out of line as I now believe it is. And I think it's important because whenever I talk to colleagues, let's say in the UK or from non-experts or people not following the news in Hungary or Poland, they don't believe what I tell them. They simply I think there is a lot of people in denial about the situation in Hungary and Poland. So I think it's important. Quite often the counter-argument I get is there are rule of law issues in Hungary and Poland, but what about Italy? What about Greece? And you also have corruption in France. I'm not denying that there are no rule of law issues elsewhere. My claim, however, is what's happening in Hungary, or what has happened for the most part in Hungary, and what's happening now in Poland is of a completely different dimension. We're talking about a phenomenon which is completely and 100% in breach of all the rules and values on which the EU is based. We are talking about essentially semi-authoritarian regimes consolidating within the EU. Now, if that's what the EU is about, then perhaps I would say it's time to set up a new one. But that I'll get back to this point later. So that's part 1 of the article, essentially. And then we look at what the Commission and what other EU institutions have done regarding Hungary, and then we study the situation in Poland. Let's say, long story short, some EU institutions have tried to fight back. It hasn't worked. Very briefly, because my time is limited, the Commission, to essentially roll back some of the rule of law breaches in Hungary, has tried to rely mostly on what we call, EU lawyers call, infringement actions. That's That's what the Commission is doing now to fight the Lex EU and the Lex NGO. So essentially, long story short, for the non-lawyers in the room, the Commission can target specific violations of EU law through this process. So he has an administrative stage, so you write to the Hungarian government, tell them, please comply with the law, please comply with EU law as we understand it. If you don't comply, we might bring a case to the Court of Justice. It's a very slow process. It's not very effective because you can only go after specific breaches of EU law. And sometimes, also it's very limited because EU law has a limited scope of application. Technically, higher education is not a direct legislative power of the EU. So it means regarding the Lex EU, the Commission has to find ways of connecting the Lex EU to the EU legal order to bring it within the scope of this infringement action. So long story short, he has technical limitations, which means that essentially by the time you get before the court and you may eventually win the case, it's too late to make any changes on the ground. So you may have won the legal battle, but you have lost the war, and that's essentially my summary of all of the infringement actions against Hungary. Against Poland, we're following more or less the same recipe, but with perhaps some technical novelties, which I don't have time to get into. So the Commission at least has learned of its failings regarding the situation in Hungary. So this is infringement actions, and you have heard also of Article 7 of the TEU, the so-called nuclear option, blah, blah, blah. The article tells you the limitations, shortcomings of this treaty provision. As I'm sure you know, there is now a file essentially being discussed within the Parliament about eventually triggering Article 7, Paragraph 1 by next September. So the article essentially it tries to see whether it's worth triggering this article. I believe that this Article 7, in terms of normally, I'm not sure how much detail we can have a Q&A, but essentially this Article 7 has never been triggered. He was supposed to be enough of a he was supposed to be dissuasive enough not to have to be triggered. And he might well be triggered against Poland before the end of this year. He might well be triggered against Hungary next year, but he has also plenty of technical procedural shortcomings. And why he hasn't been triggered against Hungary and why he hasn't been triggered against Poland? He hasn't been triggered because the Commission is of the view that he might be a remedy worse than the disease. You can agree or disagree, but that's kind of the message I'm getting from Brussels, that they believe that he may backfire. Personally, my position, our opposition is made clear in the article. We said that this is not a perfect weapon, but it should be triggered. It's already 10 minutes, so I've only covered 1/3 of the article. So essentially, we have a number of tools currently, and none of them seem to be working. So the article is making a number of proposals to essentially reinterpret some of the tools we have in the short term, and then also is trying to explore some of the long-term potential solutions. We look also at the use of cohesion structural funding, whether we can we can reform them with the view of sanctioning countries which essentially move away from EU values. Long story short, it can be done, I think, currently, and there are ways of doing it. So this morning, I think someone said that essentially it would be too complicated or that it would breach the rule of law. I don't believe that's true. Just give me time and give me a nice daily fee, and I'll rewrite you the regulation in this way within 2 weeks. What you need is political will, and the problem also is that you have unanimity regarding certain financial regulations. So you see, Hungary is never going to agree to legislation allowing the EU to sanction or suspend EU funding. But there are many other ways perhaps to get back at the backsliding states. This morning we discussed multi-speed Europe, and then that's also one of the potential outcomes we're looking at. There are many versions of what is multi-speed Europe. Actually, we could spend 2 days because every single one of us can have a different understanding of what it means in practical terms. Regarding the multi-speed Europe, it can either be an outcome of the current failure to address rule of law backsliding. It may well be that we're moving towards multi-speed Europe because we are being forced to, due to the failing of addressing rule of law backsliding in Hungary and Poland. and essentially, I'm not sure whether this would not be worse than the current disease. But if I have to summarize essentially the paper, there is not a single perfect solution. However, I believe the problem is of an existential nature. I think, personally, my personal position is we need to throw the kitchen sink at the problem. Everything should be tried in order to solve the issue, because this is more of a threat to the EU than Brexit or anything else. Migration crisis, I think it's a cup of tea by comparison to the problems raised by Hungary and Poland. There is the next very important step is not against the Article 7 file pending before the Parliament, but I think we're going to have to a large extent the Commission has failed, rightly. I mean, I don't want to be too critical of the Commission because the Commission is trying at least. The Council missing in action for many years, so completely useless. They should be ashamed of themselves. The European Parliament has just essentially been criticizing every other institutions, but what about doing some taking some action? The European Parliament can trigger Article 7. Doesn't have to wait for the Commission or the Council. The Parliament, I think, now is finally trying to do something with Hungary. But then within the Parliament, you have the European People's Party trying to sabotage this file. So all the EU institutions, essentially, we don't know what to do. They have failed. The only one which is yet to take action is the Court of Justice. We'll have, perhaps that's something you may want to pay attention to. I think there is a lot at stake regarding the forthcoming judgment with respect to the Polish forest case. So you can ask me a question about the Polish forest case, but essentially Poland last July violated a direct instruction from the Court of Justice to stop logging of a specific forest in Poland. This is the first time we have a government explicitly stating that you can go to hell to the Court of Justice. And now the Commission brought back the case before the Court of Justice to sanction Poland about non-complying with the first ruling. This has never been done before. And we shall see what the Court of Justice might do. There are some legal options which have never been tested, and perhaps I can discuss them during the Q&A, but I think this is something to pay attention to. If the Court of Justice doesn't really take a strong stand, then I might just give up and apply for Canadian citizenship and look for a job over there, because essentially we're running out of option, we're running out of time. This is very important, and I would say we want to contain the problem before it's too late. What we should, essentially we should have dealt with Hungary in a more assertive way. But again, the EU way is quite often to wait until the very last minute to deal with a problem, when it would have been less costly to deal with it many years before, or many years before it got out of hand. So thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for this insightful presentation, and I am sure that lots of your statements will be also discussed during the Q&A. Let's move to the next panelist. The next speaker will be Matej ABEJ from Graduate School of Government and European Studies in Kranj, Slovenia, and the title of presentation, What Future for the European Union?
Thank you very much. It's been a very long day, a very interesting conference. Thank you for bearing with us. A lot of problems have been put on the table, not so many solutions. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here, especially to Laszlo and to Gabor. I always like to come to Budapest and to Central Europe because I'm a great fan of it. Even though Central Europe has had its own problems, but this has always been so. We've always been living in a tragedy of Central Europe, and these times are no exception to our entire history. So, what I'm going to do today, I'm not going to talk about the future of the European Union, lato sensu. There is a paper that I produced some time ago, but following the invitation by Laszlo, I'm going to present one of the Slovenian perspectives for the future of the European Union. And I said perspectives, not visions, because you know what they say, if you have a vision you need a doctor. And this is only one of the Slovenian visions, not necessarily the most popular one or necessarily the most widely supported even among the political class in Slovenia. the question also at the beginning is whether the Slovenian perspective is a Central European perspective, as the title of today's workshop is, because Slovenians, they have a very ambiguous attitude towards Central Europe. At the beginning, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Central Europe was simply not good enough for Slovenia. So Slovenia refused to become part of the Visegrad group. Later on, the sentiment somehow changed, but with the rise of populism in Central Europe, with the successes of the Orban government and the Kaczynski regime, part of the political spectrum has been pleading to join the Visegrad group. So if there is a Central European perspective for the European Union, and something that's been quite catchy, and something that Central Europe has been good at exporting at, is precisely the populist drive, and that's been really something that's been very attractive in Slovenia, and it's been the political profile of populism has been growing. However, this is not the perspective I'm going to talk about today. Rather, I'm going to talk about the Ljubljana initiative for the new constitutional process for the European integration. The Ljubljana initiative is a civil society initiative launched at the beginning of this year, exactly on the 6th of January 2017, by a number of honorable members of the Slovenian society, some constitutional lawyers, poets, diplomats, the members of the Slovenian Academy of Science, under the leadership of Dr. Péter, who was the first president of the Slovenian Constitutional Court and who was also the judge in the European Court of Human Rights. And Mr. Jambrek also managed to convince the President of the Republic, who stepped behind this initiative and granted it sort of an institutional flavor, as it were. The Ljubljana initiative started from the premise that, as Laurent mentioned just a few moments ago, that indeed the European Union is in an existential crisis. Essentially, all the tenets of the process of the integration are and have been challenged. If you look at the economy, if you look at the security, if you look at the defense, but in particular, the political soundness of the European integration. And political soundness, what I mean by that, is of course also the quality of the rule of law and the quality of democracy. All this has been challenged, all this has taken the European Union into a spiral of crisis, into a vicious circle, through which the member states would somehow like to muddle through and find some provisional solutions, either through Article 7 or, a plethora of different institutional, political and other means, which have turned out to be essentially ineffective and boring and frustrating. So the people behind this initiative essentially were not bothered by the question, what is possible at the moment in the European Union? What can really be achieved in political terms? In that sense, we were close to Professor Fabrini, who also doesn't care what politics can actually achieve.
Which one?
The Sergio Fabrini. But we were interested into what actually is necessary at the moment, what the European Union as a polity needs to make a qualitative leap into a brighter future. And we said what the European Union actually needs. It needs an economic union, it needs a security and defense union, and it needs a political union. And the question was how to get there. How do we get there? And the outcome of our discussions was, well, let's try again with the constitutional means. Let's try again with the constitutional process for the European integration. Now, the Ljubljana initiative itself can be broken down into two parts. It has a preamble, a normative part, and then it has an actual draft text of the future constitution. Not necessarily all the members of the group behind this initiative would be in agreement with everything that is stated in the draft constitution, but we are fully in agreement about the preamble and about the normative stance behind this proposal. So the idea of it all was to start to stimulate a transnational dialogue on the future of the European Union. Nowadays, as we speak now, in late October 2017 here in Budapest, this has become already something which is on vogue. So many initiatives have been put forward. Federico Fabrini was also behind some of them. Macron is putting out others. So there is sort of I'm balancing, right? So there might indeed, as we heard, be a window of opportunity, and something needs to be done. But when we were thinking about this at the beginning of 2017, there was still sort of a very dreary situation. There was the outcome of the Dutch elections was very uncertain. There was Madame Le Pen in Paris. That was pretty high up on the post, etc., etc., etc. So the situation was really gloomy, and we wanted to make a certain breakthrough. So what in the text of the draft constitution, what do we propose there, or rather, what Mr. Jambrecht has proposed in writing this, in preparing this draft? So the first ambition was to boost the democratic credentials of the European Union, to democratize the Union, to politicize it through. And the means for that was simply to inaugurate the presidential system like in the US. So what we would be actually electing in the European Union, we, the citizens of the European Union, would be the president of the European Union. This would mean, pretty much like Juncker has just suggested some weeks ago, that of course the position of the President of the European Council and the position of the President of the European Commission would need to be merged. And through this democratic legitimation of the President of the European Union, we will also get sort of a much more democratically legitimized government, the European Commission, which would be chosen by this President. At least that is the idea. And the Parliament, this would be transformed into a bicameral Parliament. On the one hand side, you would of course have the representatives of the people, of the citizens of the EU. On the one hand, on the other side, you would have the senators. That each member state would be represented, I don't know, by 2, 3, or representatives. And in that sense, the overall image behind it, the container in which this constitutional document should be functioning, is precisely the kind of federal union that we heard about today. Speaking about the federal union, this draft document also pledges for a more transparent and much more effective division of competencies between the central supranational level and between the member states. And the division of competencies, as well as the entire document as such, indeed, is based on a liberal credo. Liberal credo in an economic sense, as well as in a social sense. So what we are actually asking for is a strong European Union that acts as a community, as an area of freedom, security, and justice. So it has strong borders, it ensures security, it ensures the rule of law. But then, as this is done, the member states inside it have as much freedom as possible to ensure and to foster their own differences and diversity within the ambit of these shared values that are stated in Article 2 of the present Treaty of Lisbon. So that's the idea of the Ljubljana Initiative. What's been going on with it in practical terms? The President of the Republic has discussed it with his Italian, Austrian counterparts. There was quite a good feedback, but then he also talked to Angela Merkel. There was a more lukewarm reception. But then a string of elections that took place later on in the European Union, including Slovenia, put these initiatives in suspense, as it were, and it's now waiting for the window of opportunity to do something that should be done with it after the maybe we started with January 2018, merging with other initiatives that have been in circulation. So now, having spoken about the Ljubljana Initiative and having spoken about the constitutional scenario for the European Union, let me finish in how much time do I still have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Let me finish with two or three sentences why I believe in theoretical terms, because I like to work as a constitutional theorist. Why I think in constitutional theoretical terms it is advantageous, it is beneficial for the European Union today to invest again into a constitution building. And I say that, as some of you might know, as a constitutional skeptic. I was sort of in a way disgusted by the inflationary use of constitutionalism, especially in 2000s, by the academics and politicians, which essentially killed the potential of constitutionalism. But now I'm coming back to it. Why? For two reasons. First of all, for two reasons which are inherent to modern constitutionalism as we know. First is the idea of discontinuity, and the second is the mobilization potential of constitutions. Modern constitutionalism has always been about a rupture with the past. If that's the case, then constitutions are needed in bad times, when things are wrong, when things go astray, and when we need a push for a better, more optimistic, more progressive future. So I think this time is now. This time certainly wasn't in 2005, when the European Union wanted to endow itself with a constitution, where the perception at least was that the times were good. The times were good. We had, skyrocketing economic growth, the enlargement was a success, all the narrative of the successful Europe. Then the constitution didn't fly. But now I think we need a discontinuity with the past, when all the tenets of the integration have been challenged, and we need something else. And secondly, this something else now finally has to come. We should stop shying away from the people. This potential, we finally have to actually mobilize the people. We need the people. We need a democratic Europe for the kind of challenges that are standing in front of us. There can be no fully fledged economic union. There can be no fully fledged security, defense, or political union without the people. That would be like the Soviet Union, if I rely on...
Soviet Union was on the people. One party, one people, one power.
But it was fake news. But it's essentially what we need to rely on the people. We have to mobilize the people, and this capacity for mobilization, if any narrative has it, then constitutionalism has it. Because constitutionalism, in the thinnest possible sense, has always been about the common search for a common good. And I believe, pretty much along the lines suggested by Macron, this time not by Federico, we saw this playing field, now it's again in favor of Macron. I think we should really start bottom up. We should ask the people. We have always feared the people, and maybe for a good reason, I don't know. But we should start with these constitutional conventions on the national level, regional level, supranational level, and then open the discussion up to really see what we have in common. And if it turns out that there is no potential, that there is no social capital, there is no political support for the kind of Europe that we actually need, for the kind of Europe that is necessary to address the problems that we are facing, then that will be a reality, and we'll need to adapt, we'll need to adjust. And if it turns out that in some member states this support exists and that in others that it doesn't, then we need to go for differentiated integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matej. And now I would like to give the floor to Balázs-Majtényi, Associate Professor of ELTE University in Budapest. He will be the discussant of the 4 papers and presentations.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank for this wishful thinking to Matej and András. But I think it is far from the real problem. Yes, I think nowadays we can describe the multi-spread Europe that there are some member states who are moving in the opposite directions, such as Hungary and Poland. And I think these member states are not take part in the same discourse. Yes, that is my first comment. And yes, and for instance, in the case of Hungary, every element of the constitutionalism are real or not functioning anymore. But my general comments. I don't like so much this poor legalistic approach. I think it's a good approach to focus on values, on constitutional values, because I think values as symbolic codes can help us to go beyond the legalistic interpretations of the institutions. If we, for instance, it was mentioned that some member states redefine its national identities and redefine also its constitutional values. But I think it is also not so good to focus only on East and Central Europe. Because I think the recent societal changes are rooted in a global societal processes. I think these processes appear in every member state. For instance, I am thinking on the economic downturn, the economic crisis, which causes societal changes. There are also cultural changes, return to local communities, strengthening of exclusive nationalism, and there are also some changes in the political system, such as the crisis of the left, crisis of the liberalism, and also the strengthening of the far right. Yes, and I think it appears in every member state. And I think, yes, Hungary and Poland is interesting, but it's interesting because some societal processes are more visible in these countries. I think that we know that I think the same things in every member state, but it's happened that in Hungary some events and some rhetoric which we know from politics are appeared also in the constitutional system. But I think it can happen also in other member states, also in Western Europe, because it's rooted in global societal processes. And what I would like to say that in this situation, I think the EU has in a very difficult situation, because if it has some possibilities. EU can use some existing legal instruments, or it may be it is also possible to find some new instruments. But the case is if the EU will apply these instruments against Hungary or against Poland, I think it will strengthen the Eurosceptics who are the Brexit as a role model, or it can be strengthen the autocrats who has the Hungarian public wrote as a role model. That's all.
Thank you.
We will collect 3 questions and then we will
another round.
Move
I have 2, but they are connected and very short, and maybe the lawyers can answer simply with a yes and or no.
Okay.
My first question is whether it is possible to merge the 2 presidents, the President of the European Council and the President of the Commission, into one president without a treaty change. My second question is whether it's possible to have transnational party list at the European elections without a treaty change. Thank you.
You were second? There was someone else?
Yeah. You were second, and Dora was the third. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks. Just a question for Matej and for JAKAB. So to Matej, I think to some extent I agree with you, but don't underestimate the process dimension in constitution making. I think this is an extremely important issue, and as you know, in the American case, if it wasn't for the coup of the framers in changing rules of ratification and designing a process that would have allowed the Constitution to enter into force, we would not have had the American Constitution. So that is essential. I think the methodology of treaty change is very important. And as I was saying this morning, I think we really need to overcome unanimity. And one of the limits of the Ljubljana initiative is that it still relies on unanimity for entry into force, as far as I recollect, which basically gives to Orban a veto right over changes in the European Union. Now to András. If he's not paying attention to me at all.
Because his name is András.
András. So you know I'm a great fan of your legal theory work, and I also very much appreciated your criticism of the German Constitutional Court thinking on the demos, etc., etc. But as a new institutional lawyer, I cannot let you go away with the presentation you made about parliamentarism. And I think there are a number of criticisms to that. I'll just mention a few, and I suppose there might be more. So the first one is, I think you're making an unnecessary reduction of democracy with parliamentarism. And of course, I agree with you that the European Union needs more democracy, but there are multiple forms of government which are democratic. You have a presidential regime, as much as Matej mentioned in the Ljubljana proposal. You have a semi-presidential system, and in fact, two of the three oldest democracies in the world, France and the United States, do not have parliamentary systems. So you are collapsing the concept of democracy with parliamentarism. Second, your comparison between the UK and the EU is very disingenuous. It's very disingenuous because the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. So it's perfectly possible to develop a constitutional convention in a system where there is no written text. But in Europe, we have a constitution. It's the Treaty on the European Union with the Treaty on the Functioning. And so when we discuss the parliamentarization, we need to look at the text, which is Article 17, and that creates limits to what can be done creatively. Third, you presented to us a paper published in 2012, and a lot has happened since then, including the Spitzenkandidaten process in the 2014 election. So, in a way, history has gone in the direction you were pointing to. But my question to you, it doesn't follow you, but maybe they listen to you. You're influential. But the point is, has it worked? And the answer is no. And why it hasn't worked? Because, as every single presentation before yours today pointed out, it is the European Council that governs Europe. So you're pushing in a direction which is a non-starter because, as everyone mentioned, the power is laying elsewhere. So you can also parliamentarize the Commission, but it's not going to help us much if the power sits in the European Council. And my fourth and last criticism, there might be more, is even if it worked, would it be a good development? And I have serious normative problems there. You are pushing in a system where all the powers would be left to the 751 members of the European Parliament. But do you know how many Germans are sitting in the European Parliament? How many French and how many Italians? Basically, the 4 or 5 largest states of the European Union would be governing through their members of Parliament. And since national divergences are still the main dividing lines across Europe, I think this would be a result that in all the small member states where I've worked would never be acceptable.
Thank you. And Laurent.
Thank you so much for the very lovely presentation. I have a comment for Mr. Laurent. So in my research, we call the process of what you described as democratic backsliding or backsliding of rule of law in the EU, de-Europeanization or strategic de-Europeanization, and totally agree with you, it's a process that is very strategically done. However, what we try to do, and this might be a good news for the gloomy state of affairs that you presented, is that it's contested. There are a number of actors in Hungary who actually contest the government's attack of EU values. And actually, we are able to show civil society actors who are able to unite with international actors who are successfully blocking at least some of the attempts. In our case studies, the central bank independence or transparency of central bank acting, and also segregation of Roma children. And Martin József Martin can testify that how the Hungarian Transparency International was very successful in using the Hungarian court system to actually enforce its own vision of how the central bank should function, but the level of transparency should follow. So that's that.
Okay. György, a következő körben, jó? Next round, sorry.
Very briefly, I mean, I like to share your optimism. I don't, because this is my understanding of the tactics being used by autocrats or would-be autocrats. As in the case of Hungary, the key argument I've been told by EU lawyers is that we're not going to trigger Article 7 for all the political reasons. But the key legal argument why they went after Poland and they're not going after Hungary, they keep telling me that the national judiciary is working in Hungary. And they're using some of the very examples you have told me. The EU lawyers tell me, you see, it means they're able to win still before national courts. My reading, but perhaps I'm just too cynical, is that actually the Hungarian government is deliberately losing a few legal battles just to essentially throw a few bones, so then in the eyes of the external world, the national judiciary still works, and that gives a perfect excuse for the Commission not to interfere, and by for instance, subjecting Hungary to the rule of law framework. According to Commissioner Jourova, before the European Parliament a year ago, national rule of law safeguards in Hungary are perfectly fine, and therefore we can just fight Orban on a case-by-case basis through infringement proceedings. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm wrong. In my view, essentially, it's Orban just throwing a few bones just from time to time, just to essentially, while people are celebrating a few legal victories, they're losing the war and they're not paying attention to what's being done essentially elsewhere. The autocrat strategy quite often is one step back when under pressure, two steps forward as soon as attention has shifted elsewhere. In Poland, they're not as, let's just say, they're less subtle, and in a way they force the hands of the Commission. They left the Commission no choice but to step in because they have been violating the Polish constitution in plain sight. I mean, what they've done to the Polish Constitutional Court, never Orban or his lawyers would have done the same, or they would have ended with the same outcome, but they would have used legal means, and they would have done it very progressively without violating not only the spirit of the law, but so obviously the letter of the law when the world was looking. So hopefully you're right, and hopefully I'm wrong.
But I was just suggesting the cases that we're looking at as successful contestation, to study them so that to see why we are successful, how they mobilize not only local but international actors, and that then coalitions can be forced to fight Orban.
No, I mean, perhaps you're right, but I think we're losing, essentially. Yes, the Lex EU, yes, there is a huge collective, essentially. We, not only internally but externally, everyone is trying to help. Are we going to, who am I to speak on behalf of Hungarian people fighting back on the Lex EU front? But essentially, my thinking is essentially we're not, the EU, essentially the rule of law is not really the winner here, because we look at essentially just some elements of the puzzle. We're not looking at the overall picture, and we're not looking at the long-term essentially impact of all the separate violations of the rule of law. We're not looking, the EU has failed in Hungary, first of all because he has not understood for a long time what was happening. And we keep essentially we keep missing the wood for the trees. I think that's the expression. Essentially, we're just looking at separate violations without looking at the cumulative impact, and in fact, we're never looking at the blueprint. I think there is a blueprint. Autocrats are learning from one another. I think Kim once said worst practices now travel across jurisdictions. And I think she's right. And also, Orban and his lawyers know how the EU functions. So. Essentially, it's a death of the rule of law by 1,000 cuts. But in the process, whenever the pressure is too much on the Hungarian government, then just throw a few bones. And that's how I would...
There's a small comment from a political point of view, but not from a judicial point of view. The difference between Hungary and Poland is also in the fact that Fidesz is part of the majority coalition in the European Parliament. And the Spitzenkandidaten need to have the support of the representative of Fidesz vis-à-vis the competition with the socialists, where Poland, the PiS is part of a very eccentric party, and now they lost their own main protector, so namely the British Conservatives. So in some way, it seems to me that Viktor Orbán is much more able to play the political game in order to keep under control the legalistic instincts of the Commission, because the Commission depends at the very end of the day on the majority of which is part, where this is not the case for Poland. So if you follow this road, probably for Poland, for the peace would be much better to enter in the European People's Party in order to do what Orban could do without being controlled fully by the Commission.
Yes, no, you're right. Party politics does, it is a factor. In fact, the article, we have a section on party politics within the European Parliament as an additional factor of action or inaction. I was just describing the legal reasoning.
Yes, sure.
I was not denying the existence of political factors as well, making things even more complicated. Yes. No, it's in the article as well. And in fact, just 2 hours ago, I sent a tweet to Manfred Weber and complaining to him about the inaction, asking for them to expel Fidesz. So I do that also in my spare time. I know the importance of political factors, and you're right, it is actually, he has been used by Orban quite successfully, and there are plenty of additional legal arguments that Orban has been able to use successfully, or political reasoning or narrative, which has been. Orban has been a very effective autocrat, if I may say, if I dare saying.
Instead of to activate Article 7, probably the European People's Party should activate the expulsion of Fidesz.
I've been screaming this same message for the past 12 months.
Okay, good.
And for the time,
receive a nice fee, we can share.
Yes. What I know for a fact is that the EPP now is essentially split in half, but we need at least 2/3 of them by next September. So that's the goal. So each of you should write, anyone who is not from Hungary should write to whatever MEP you have from the EPP in your own country and put the pressure on them. I think it's not simply, I speak as a lawyer, so essentially most of my time I spend it on legal argumentations or legal avenues. But politics do matter. And in fact, if we have something to do, you can sign petitions asking the EPP to expel Fidesz. I think he would actually perhaps be more successful than any of the legal avenues I have explored. We don't know, but I would say it wouldn't hurt for sure. So, sorry for having monopolized the discussion a bit.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I'm trying to go through the remarks or questions. What about this transnational lists? First of all, there is according to Article 223 of the Treaty of the European Union, you would need detailed rules of the election, and for that you need the Council to act unanimously on the proposal of the Parliament. So it is already a really complicated procedure. It is so complicated that it actually never been implemented. So in theory, these detailed rules could be made by the European Parliament, by the Council. They have never been made. They don't exist. What you have now, some kind of basic principles and so on. But if you really want to have this transnational issue, according to my view, you would actually need treaty change, because in the treaty you have numbers for every country, and I don't know how you
would. Treaty. It's in a European Council decision.
Okay.
But you need unanimity and ratification.
For unanimity, sorry about that.
It's like a treaty change.
So it's almost like a treaty change, but you would need that. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks for the correction. So you need that. It's similarly difficult to do that. Yeah. The second is, can you merge the two positions? There is no explicit prohibition about that, so it has never been done. I'm also checking it with my colleagues. There is no explicit prohibition. In theory, it could be made. That's the short answer. The third one, that's a few remarks by Federico. Democracy and parliamentarism. There are also other forms of parliamentarism also other forms of democracy, except outside of parliamentarism. That's true, but I think that's the only point of leverage where you can improve the situation in the European Union. How could you make the European Union into a presidential democratic system? The changes would have been much more serious. You would need probably some kind of direct election of the president of the European Union. I cannot really see actually how that could happen, so I'm a bit puzzled about the other options. I think that's kind of the nearest option. I know it's not perfect, because as you say, also you're right, that it's not simply the Commission. It's obvious it's a very simplified thing that I presented. It's not simply the Commission, which is the government of the European Union, but there are also views which say that it is rather the Council. But I think it's a far-reaching debate. I think it's more the Commission and much less the Council. The Council is more like a second chamber, but that's we can debate that after the.
But the European Council is not.
Okay, we can discuss that a little bit later. And your last remark, whether you can have constitutional conventions with a written constitution. Yes, you can have constitutional conventions also with a written constitution. You can have constitutional conventions in any constitutional system. You just don't conceptualize it that way. I think that the strong conceptualization of constitutional conventions in the UK happened because you don't have a written constitution, but actually constitutional conventions do exist in every constitutional system. Just put it shortly. What I think about it.
Whether they can be contra-constitutional, that's the problem. Question.
Well, briefly, on the merging of the two presidencies, well, a very handy thing to do would be, because the President of the European Commission is at the same time member of the European Council, so the members of the European Councils could elect the President of the European Commission for their president. There would still be two presidencies, but essentially would be the function would be exercised by one person, right? There will be some problems in terms, because the two institutions represent different interests and there are some constraints, but it could be done without the treaty change. In terms of transnational lists, I think there are even fewer problems. Of course, the obstacle is the political will and the unanimity, but I think it can be done without the treaty change. And even if it says that Slovenia elects 8 members of the European Parliament, this doesn't mean that they cannot be taken from the transnational list. So I don't see a problem there. When it comes to the procedure for constitution making, I agree with you, but I would like, my normative take would be that at the moment of foundation, if we start something qualitatively new in the European Union, it would be great to have those countries who actually consented to that. If you started with a new foundation with someone being locked into an agreement that he or she doesn't like, we have a problem, and I would like to go along that route.
I would just like to remind all of us that the European Parliament has on a number of occasions proposed to elect its members differently, but we have plenty of precedents when the response from other institutions was no. So the political will has never been there since 1974, and that really bizarre sui generis document that establishes the elections of Parliament now is a profoundly problematic base for what we're having in place. But apparently all the institutions are locked around this issue.
Thank you very much, and now we will proceed to the second round. I will give the floor to everybody, so so everybody who wants to ask. Okay, so but please keep your questions very short, because we are running out of time. So first, Jörgi, please.
I just want to make the comment that I wouldn't like you to leave this room with the impression that there is any hope at the moment that Hungary is going in the right direction. Not at all. For example, you mentioned that there are NGOs like Transparency International and others which are having some small results. Well, these NGOs have been threatened by the government just a couple of days ago that they are going to be observed by the National Security Service. The other thing is, you started your perfect presentation with two statements that the first activities of the Orbán government was to interfere with the Constitutional Court, and the other is to obtain the media. And exactly because this obtaining of the and grabbing the media is just going on and on and on. Now I don't know, about 3/4 of the Hungarian media is totally in Orbán's hand or his cronies' hand. There is practically no local media, for example, free media at all. So whatever these NGOs would reach any small result, no the people are not going to get to know it from the media. There's just no way to convey them the information. This is the way he is consolidating and putting, cementizing his power on the next elections. And the other comment is that I think that it's again a mistake, a big mistake from the part of the EU. But first of all, to allow that the media would get into government hands, it's absolutely unimaginable how this could have happened in the European Union. I say this as a journalist, of course. And the other thing is that I think it would be much better to put Hungary first, if under the rule of law mechanism or the Article 7 mechanism, and not Poland, because if at all, I think Poland would not block maybe, or could be, or persuaded not to block the procedure, because Hungary is so much close to Vladimir Putin. You see, the second biggest Hungarian university just gave a prize to Vladimir Putin a month ago. And we know that the Polish wouldn't like that. So I think the other way around, Orban would always give hand to Kaczynski, but I'm not sure that the other way around would work too.
Zsuzsa, then last one, then.
Thank you very much. I'm Zsuzsa Szelényi, a member of the Hungarian Parliament, and I deeply doubt the European Union can mean anything legally against Hungary or against the liberals. We witnessed this in the last couple of years, how Viktor Orban oversmarted by political means basically every actors of the EU and also European governments by basically creating different narratives. So law can say something and he can say something else. Like just a couple of weeks ago he said, yeah, Hungarian government accepts the decision of the European court on the quota, but they will not fulfill. Well, and that's it. Now here we are. But that's not just narrative, it's also coalition building. I mean, he could find good coalition with the EPP, he could make a very good coalition with the Polish whenever they were ready, and then now two of them can veto easier than Orban himself. And also, of course, he could easily bribe and compromise and corrupt other European politicians because they are some of them are easy to bribe and easy to corrupt. So I'm very skeptical of legal solutions directly against the illiberal state, but still I have a question to you. Mm-hmm. I trust lawyers very much. And I also don't...
Some of them.
He is a lawyer, of course. He's a lawyer. And again, just one other idea. This is why sanctions never worked. And any kind of case which could have been looked as a sanction, because there was never political will, and there will never be, under the current status quo, a political will to make any crisis. So no Article 7 or anything will ever be. It's not because of legal reasons, it's because of political reasons. So, but what about looking ahead? So let's think that in the couple of next week there will be new institutions, maybe not so visionary as we've heard today, which would be really nice, but something should be done for, let's say, security. And security and border control is something that is important for Viktor Orban because it's an identity-making narrative from his side. So is there any possibility under the current status quo and culture, EU culture, to make special conditions to participation in the new tools? Like, for example, Hungary can also only participate in the new common border control if it accepts the new common asylum rules, migration rules, or anything else, anything related to democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Laszlo?
Thanks. Dimitry, I have a question. What would be your first 3 steps to depart from the status quo? What do you suggest? Laurent, I still have to read this paper, but my question is, this was linked actually to the idea of Kim that we started to discuss in March, that perhaps the problem is not with the size of the club, or the speed or the strength with which the EU uses the existing clubs. Perhaps it is the nature of the chaos. I think it was Kim who raised the question that perhaps the two-speed Europe might be the way to get in a situation in which the first round members create club goods that are lucrative enough that might induce societies and also political elites in the countries left out to try to change the behavior. I'm thinking of the Slovak or the Romanian situation of the 90s, when even the signaling of the possibility of exclusion from the club goods of the EU resulted in Slovakia in basically uprising, and Austrian of Mecsári in 1.5 years, or in Romania, the changing of policies and the attitude of Iliescu, who discovered that deep in his heart he has always been a Democrat.
Being a Hungarian master's student at CEU, I can totally confirm what you just said, because actually in the Lex CEU, the tactics of the government was to prolong with 1 year the deadline, whereas meanwhile the CEU has agreed with the board college, so the government would only need to sign the agreement. And Rector Ignatieff is, I think, a little bit too optimistic as far as the Hungarian government's intentions are concerned. And I also think approving or confirming the two other people talking about it before me, that it's very good tactics, and the problem is the media, the main problem, that it doesn't get to the people, especially in the countryside, which is 80% of the population, and it's a very important factor in the elections. And the other thing is that the infringement actions, if Hungary is condemned, then it results in taxpayers' money payment to the EU. And what my question is, whether, because there is this EU prosecutor, and of course Hungary doesn't want to join the club in this sense, and in my opinion it would be absolutely logical to relate cohesion funds to the payment of the cohesion funds to joining the EU prosecutor, because that could provide transparency, or at least more transparency, because our national prosecutor, Mr. Péter, will never ever start any process against the party comrade of Fidesz. And I also support the idea of containment at all levels of Fidesz in the European levels, and we will see there will be the big test next year. And I think, of course, hope dies last on the Hungarian side, and we also try to think, or hope to think, that there is a possibility to change this system only on the national level, or like to go to vote for the opposition. But there are big problems with the opposition at the moment, so it will be a big test whether this system will be changed or not.
Any other questions? No more questions. Okay, so please try to answer briefly to these questions. Who will start?
So the three ways to change the status quo. This is what the court has been painfully working on for many years now, because it's obvious to all the court watchers, and I start with the court because every decision about rights is de facto a decision about the scope of power. So once we start with human rights, we have to answer why a particular right should be regulated by the EU level rather than the national level. And then the easy answer was always, let's connect it to our understanding of the internal market, which is in the treaties, which is our main objective. And then we will be denying the right to plenty of those whom we don't deem good enough in our eyes, because our eyes are internal market eyes. The outcome of that was that every single vulnerable citizen cannot possibly qualify. If you are poor, if you have tragedy in the family, if you have a bad CV in the eyes of the court, you are nobody. But in fact, you don't exist at all in the eyes of this system. So it's one of the most cruel systems, given that the member state governments have only one power, They can only regulate the situation of their own citizens who don't fall within the scope of EU law worse than the EU regulates EU level citizens, because discrimination is prohibited. So if you give better rights to your own citizens who don't fall within the scope of supranational law, you are in breach of the law, or you have to adapt it to fit everybody. So the only right, if you want to use your sovereign power to regulate, is basically to humiliate and to undermine the rights of your own citizens. This is something that has been a day-to-day practice in all the member states of the European Union, outside probably of Italy, because Italy stands out as a spectacular example of how national constitutional system, correct me if I'm wrong, can actually, well, I don't want to exaggerate this, but at least the Corte Costituzionale was trying to make sure that the Italian constitution works in such a way that Italians don't suffer too much as a result of not falling within the scope of EU law. So then our main enemy is the internal market as the main way of allocating competences, because the EU has outgrown the internal market, and because fundamental rights of citizens cannot be dependent precisely on the economic cross-border considerations. So then the move away, and we have a number of cases already in front of the Court of Justice which have been decided that way, and they have given some horrible examples, like McCarthy with a handicapped child, and the court finding no cross-border situation, which resulted in the deportation of the only breadwinner in the family, and basically the condemnation of the lady to the home, given that the UK didn't provide sufficient support for the family. So the only way then is to depart from this internal market distribution of the approach to the scope of the law, and to start using rights themselves, the intensity of violation of rights, in order to see whether the EU intervenes. And this is something that was connected to Hungary, in fact, by Armin von Bogdandy and his friends in Heidelberg, in an attempt to argue that probably particularly serious violations of citizens' rights to a basic democratic system, or like we can discuss what kind of rights we can be speaking about, could trigger EU's intervention, and this will be, then the situation will be by definition within the scope of EU law. So this is something in his eyes that could help Hungary and that could help Poland. I disagree with that use of this kind of logic, but the logic itself, which is already apparent from the case of the Court of Justice, is obviously a valuable path to pursue. And then 2-3, obviously we need an ability to kick a state out, because that will be a real way to pressure the local elites and to make the local opposition work. Because if the opposition is lazy, and if people use their free movement rights to leave the country instead of actually mobilizing and fighting, I'm not blaming anyone in Hungary, but it's actually quite shocking not to have any opposition, right? Or at least the Financial Times never mentions it, or like basic venues which we probably follow have never heard about any opposition in Hungary. In Poland, probably a little bit. And then, in order to stimulate that, you need to have a threat of a micronational disaster, which the Brits have already chosen upon themselves, without any pushing, is obviously leaving the EU. So then, if the EU can kick you out, it's great. Do we need to change the treaties for that? Probably not. Look at the illegal bullying of Austria when Haider was elected. Everybody simply came together and mobbed the government to change their ways. So in fact, we don't need Article 7 with respect. We don't need 259. We don't need 258. We don't need 260. All that cannot inflict enough pain in order to ensure an overthrow of a government, basically. In order to overthrow a government, you need an existential threat to the country. You need a Brexit replicated, but not based on the volition of the people. And that's something that the governments in the EU can do. And that's probably something that will also be legal, following the Austrian example. When we say we simply react, choosing the path to build our actions outside of the framework of the treaties, and then out Hungary goes.
It's been a long day, so very briefly. I mean, you asked me, Laszlo, about the use of cards. I don't think strong positive incentives work with autocrats. Hungary is having all the carrots with none of the sticks currently. I mean, look at the EU funding pouring in and the foreign direct investments, blah, blah. I don't think Orban would be receptive to any kind of additional benefits he could derive from EU membership because there are none left. Essentially, I think the time for positive incentives has come to an end, or perhaps I misunderstood your question. It's about whether we have any effective sticks and whether the legal sticks are more or less effective than the political sticks. I think essentially, as I said during my presentation, there is not a single effective way of dealing with the problem. I think we need essentially a multifaceted answer, using legal avenue, using political avenues, but we also need, in fact, to that extent I would agree with Dimitry, is that we need also some leadership at the level of the European Council. To a large extent, I mean, we did highlight in the previous session the role of Germany. We did emphasize German leadership as very important. To a certain extent, I have to agree. On the rule of law front, actually, I was told many times by policymakers that the key member state essentially pulling the brake on all the more effective use or the stronger use of rule of law instruments is Germany, actually. They prevented meaningful action. The EPP leadership, if you look at it, is mostly German driven. And articles, as far as I know, but perhaps I'm wrong, not only has Germany kind of informally refused for the rule of law framework to be activated against Hungary, but they recently kind of de facto vetoed the triggering Article 7, paragraph 1 against Poland. I could be misinformed, that's what I'm hearing. My sources should remain obviously nameless. But I'm saying essentially political leadership at the level of member states is very key. And the last time, leaving aside the example of Hungary, with Poland we could not have a more obvious example of an EU member state taking the piss, to use a very informal expression, and yet they're getting away with murder. So what does that suggest? Regardless of whether we have the right tools, suggests that there is a lack of political leadership somewhere, and either it is because other governments don't simply care about rule of law backsliding in Poland as long as the cross-border impact is limited, or they are in denial about the problem, or perhaps they have bigger worries. So I think it's a mix of reasons. But essentially, that's beyond my pay grade. Essentially, I'm a lawyer, so I'm looking at what's available on the basis of the current treaties. I'm not saying I would love to see the treaties being revised, but that's no point wasting time on this. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's like asking Turkeys to vote for Christmas, because unanimity is required. So you can imagine Poland and Hungary. So essentially, I'm only perhaps my only hope. I mean, the only EU institution, as I mentioned, which is yet to take a stand on this front, is the Court of Justice. If the Court of Justice does not effectively deal with the Polish act of defiance regarding a previous judgment he adopted in July, and then essentially, then we can give up on the current institutional framework, and multi-speed Europe might be just essentially the only potential solution. But then it would be essentially not something like a positive course of action. It would be more kind of an admission of defeat, and essentially it would be like we'll have a core Europe with surrounded by some semi-autocratic regimes, which would be used where we can essentially have factories there. We can use them as a kind of a factory floor because then they'd be cheap and the workers will have no political rights. So it would be great, stable environment for investments, especially from Germany. And since they'd be outside where the key decisions are adopted, then essentially the negative impact on decision-making process could be contained. So you could see that multi-speed Europe perhaps is just a way of containing rather than addressing the issue, and I'm afraid, that's not the kind of Europe I dreamt of. But I'm afraid that's essentially, if we cannot deal with the problem as I have described within the current framework, then we're going to have to come up with a new framework. And in fact, Brexit might help this move towards a multi-speed Europe, where essentially you're going to end up with the non-democratic regimes are going to be left alone, but they're going to be excluded from where the real decision-making process takes place. I would rather try to finish on a more optimistic note, but I'm not the one concluding this session, so hopefully Gabor has something to say which would be a bit more cheerful. But that's my concluding remark. Anyone else?
We have nothing to add.
Okay, thank you very much. Undoubtedly, we had a very thought-provoking discussion, thanks to our distinguished panelists and discussant, and also to your